Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to our AJA weekly Zoom speaker series. We've missed you over the last couple of weeks, but we hope you had a wonderful Sukkot and a wonderful time in the Sukkah with your families and friends. I'd like to thank our partners tonight, IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, who have joined us for this week's speaker series. Legislation has been presented to prohibit the publication of misinformation and disinformation on social media. It provides an exemption for governments and government authorities, but individuals and community organizations such as us, the AJA, may be caught out. Is this the death of free speech in Australia? Will the government impose more control of expression? Tonight, to talk to us about this really important topic, we would like to thank John Storey, the Director of Law and Policy for the Institute of Public Affairs, who will outline the proposal and the implications this will have on everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, John Storey. Thank you to all our viewers tonight who are here with us live, watching on Facebook, watching the recording, or listening tomorrow on J-Air. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Danielle, and thank you all for inviting me. The government's proposed misinformation and disinformation bill, to cut to the chase, is, in the opinion of the Institute of Public Affairs, the greatest threat to freedom of speech in Australia's peacetime history. And the reason we've concluded that is that it is fundamentally based on a false premise, and that is that we can know what the truth is in real time, and that we should censor things that are not the truth. And that always raises the question, the truth according to who? Who gets to decide? What I intend to do is go through how this proposal works in quickly, just in the basics of what it is, because I know some of you probably not quite sure exactly how it works. Then I'll go through 5 problems that we've identified with it, and then I'll finish with some concluding thoughts, and then throw it open to questions. How this legislation is intended to work is that all social media companies and other digital platforms will be required to have misinformation codes. And these misinformation codes will set out how they will tackle misinformation on their platforms. And that will require them to identify who is spreading misinformation and silencing those people or certain content from the internet. That could be by blocking certain users of social media, blocking certain topics, or shadow banning and making it harder to find certain issues. Now, although they're called misinformation codes, that makes it sound like it's a sort of voluntary code of conduct, but they aren't voluntary. The legislation requires all social media to have one of these codes, and they need to be approved by the regulator, ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority. And if ACMA is not satisfied with a code or thinks that a social media company is not complying with it, they can impose what's called a misinformation standard. And so effectively, the social media companies will have one of these things imposed on them one way or another. Then ACMA, what happens is ACMA monitors the social media companies to see if they are complying with these codes or standards. And if they are not, they can impose huge fines on the social media companies, up to 5% of the global turnover of these companies. Now, we're talking about some of the largest companies in the world: Google, Twitter, now X, Facebook, Meta. These are huge companies with a huge global turnover. So if they fail to comply with these codes and ACMA goes after them, the consequences could be enormous. So in summary, how it works is that the government is deputising the social media companies to impose censorship on misinformation on the government's behalf, with the stick of being able to impose fines if they don't do their job properly. So what's wrong with all this? Well, as I said, 5 problems. And the first one I alluded to in the opening is, well, who gets to decide what is or isn't misinformation? And the scheme of the legislation effectively creates a bit of a three-way dance. The first is that ACMA will have a say. It will be ultimately ACMA who decides if the social media companies have been compliant. So it'll be ACMA's view on whether you're sufficiently censoring misinformation that will be determinative. The social media companies themselves will have a role. But the way the Act works and operates is that the social media companies are likely to outsource much of the determination of what is or isn't misinformation to so-called fact checkers. These are third-party experts or self-appointed experts to make determinations on what is or isn't fact check correct. So we've got public servants, social media companies themselves, and fact checkers. The problems for, sort of right of centre people, such as I expect most of the audience and certainly the members of the IPA, is that all three of those organisations are known for having a bias against right of centre viewpoints. In the case of the public sector, all we have to do is look at the results of the Voice to Parliament referendum last year, where the country voted 60% no against it. But the one state or territory that did endorse the Voice was the ACT, where all the public servants live, who endorsed it to the tune of 60%, a complete reversal of the general public. Social media companies themselves, it's been revealed, have a left of centre bias, not necessarily at the ownership, that's a little bit split, but in the teams that operate their safety and community standards teams. This was revealed in what was known as the Twitter files. So when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he got some investigative journalists to check out what was happening there prior to him taking it over, which revealed that the Twitter staff are more than happy to do the bidding of the Biden administration when it comes to censoring certain content, mostly related to COVID-19. If you're interested more on that, I have a podcast called Australia Censored on the IPA YouTube channel, and I've interviewed Michael Schellenberger, who you may have heard of, who ran that investigation. Finally, these fact-checking organisations. There are 3 accredited fact-checking organisations in Australia, and the IPA did an analysis of the work that they've done over recent years. And surprise, surprise, it's filled with left-wing journalists and academics who have a bias against right of centre. I'll just hit you with a few stats before I move on from this point. So we had a look at all the fact-checking determinations of all 3 organisations during the Voice. 91%, so there was 187 in total, and 170 of them, which is 90%, were targeted against the no case. So 91% of fact checks were targeted against the no case. We've also looked more broadly at fact checking. So when it comes to fact checking Australian politicians or political parties, they are favourable to the left 65% of the time, and they're favourable to the right 35% of the time. So about 2 to 1 of their fact checkings on when fact-checking politicians, Australian politicians, favours the left. We also had a look at their fact-checking on COVID-19, and there was an enormous number of them. Over 500 different fact checks were done. 94% targeted critics of government policy. So face masks, mandates, and all that, lockdowns and that. They were fact-checked. And the final one is climate change. We've looked at the hundreds of fact checks on climate change. 81% target critics of the sort of established narrative of man-made climate change. So these fact checks are not independent organisations. They're clearly biased, but they will be the ones that determine whether something is misinformation. Which gets me to my second point, the definition of misinformation, and it is simply too broad and subjective. The definition of misinformation in the Act, I've got it here if you don't mind me reading. It is content that contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive, and the provision of the content is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. So sort of two parts to this: false, misleading, and deceptive, and if it causes serious harm. So the problem with the definition of false, misleading, and deceptive is that it's so broad that it doesn't even mean that you could say something truthful and it is not a defense. You can say something truthful and it can be considered misinformation. And the way it works is that misleading and deceptive can include truthful statements, but that lack context or are taken out of context. And the problem with that is that we're talking social media posts here. We're talking YouTube clips. We're talking, memes on the internet. All the content is never provided. It's never provided in its totality. And so someone can argue that, let's say you say the government's doing a bad job with the economy because inflation's so high. Someone could say, well, you didn't provide full context. You didn't explain that the interest rate's slightly lower this quarter than last quarter, or that interest rates are higher in some other country than they are in this country. And because you didn't provide the full context, it was misleading what you said, and therefore it could be misinformation. In other words, it comes down entirely to the viewpoint of the decision maker. Almost anything can be considered misinformation if you disagree with it on the basis that, well, you didn't provide all the information necessary. That leads me to this idea of serious harm. Again, the definition of serious harm is so broad that it really doesn't restrict things whatsoever. And the way I couch this when I've spoken on it is, I'd really like the communications minister to give an example of something that is harmful that isn't seriously harmful. It's no limitation at all. And the definitions of serious harm covers things that, really almost anything could be considered serious harmful. So one of them is, for example, harm to the operation or integrity of a Commonwealth state, territory, or local government electoral or referendum process. So does that mean if a politician says something that someone thinks is a lie or false, well, that could influence the outcome of the election? So does that mean that's harmful? Harm to public health in Australia, including to the efficacy of preventative health measures in Australia. Well, you don't need to be a genius to know what they were targeting there. They were targeting the measures taken against during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, lots of people had disputing ideas on whether things like mask mandates were effective, or whether vaccine mandates are reasonable, whether lockdowns were worth the cost. But it could be argued that such viewpoints harm public health. And there are others like that. Effectively, it's no limitation at all what the definition of serious harm is. It will come down to the decision maker concerned. Almost any contentious issue could be seen to be misleading, a viewpoint on any contentious issue, and that's likely to cause harm to the various aspects set out in the bill. There probably are a few exceptions, and this is the crazy sort of catch-22 aspect of this legislation. There are probably some things that are clearly misinformation, or almost everyone would agree is false. I'm talking things like the Earth is flat, or the moon landing was a hoax, or something like that. The thing is, those sorts of things you can go, well, yeah, that's false, but they don't cause any harm. They don't harm the Australian economy. They don't harm Australians' public health. They don't vilify a certain group. It's the contentious issues that can cause such harm. If you disputes over health measures, disputes over economic policy, criticisms of things like immigration policy. They're the ones that could cause harm under this test, and they're the ones that are most contested and most difficult to prove are misinformation. The third problem with this legislation is that it creates a two-tiered system. So certain people will be exempt from these rules. It doesn't matter what they say, they cannot be silenced under this law as misinformation. And that is professional news content, parody and satire, and anything of an academic, artistic, scientific or religious purpose. So the problem with this is that it's really part of a narrative that undergirds this legislation that experts know best. Scientists, we can trust them. Journalists, we can trust them. It's really only targeted at ordinary Australians. They're the only ones whose voices might be silenced under this legislation. And it creates a caste of people that it cannot be considered as causing misinformation, which really gets to the nub of it, because if the target is to prevent misinformation, well, the media spread misinformation just as virulently as social media does, mainstream journalists. And scientists can spread misinformation. Anyone can spread misinformation. The fourth problem with the legislation is that it will incentivise censorship. What I mean by that is that the ratchet only turns one way. This law imposes enormous fines for failing to censor misinformation, but there is no penalty for falsely censoring truthful information. So even social media companies that are attempting to be balanced or don't have a particular ideological bias either way, their natural incentive will be to censor first, ask questions later. Because if there's something edgy that's being promoted on their platform that they think might be considered misinformation, well, they could get fined for that, but there's no consequences for censoring it. So the incentive will be censor first to make sure we don't get in trouble. And that will create a chilling effect on debate online. The final issue with the legislation is that it's open to political abuse, and it's open to political abuse in two ways. Firstly, it has several mechanisms where the Minister for Communications can actually effectively notify ACMA that they want ACMA to investigate certain issues. So that means that if the government of the day doesn't like something that's being said online, a particular, think back to the pandemic or whatever the issue is, they think that's misinformation. The government of the day can notify ACMA, and then ACMA can then notify the social media companies and say, hey, we think this is misinformation. If you guys want to avoid any problems, you might want to have a look at it. So it's open to partisan political abuse. And the other thing is the ACMA's investigatory powers. They've got quite draconian powers to drag people into tribunals to answer questions as part of their investigations as to compliance with the misinformation codes. And it's no surprise, it's no shock who will be the target of that, and that's Elon Musk's X. For some reason, the political left has just had conniptions since Elon Musk took over X. It's the one genuinely free speech platform, or large platform. There's a few others like Rumble and whatever, and that's the one that always gets the ire of governments around the world, who think that no, too much free speech is not a good thing because it's spreading hate or misinformation or other things. They'll effectively be able to drag in the employees of X or any other company to answer questions as to compliance and what they're doing to prevent misinformation. And it'd be a death by 1,000 cuts for these companies who might, we call it lawfare. It'll be able to be abused to target certain social media companies. So they're the sort of five main problems we have with the legislation. I'll just conclude with a few more overarching points and then throw it open to questions. One is censorship doesn't work. Censorship never works. So even if you had completely fair and unbiased bureaucrats and fact checkers who are administering this process, it still wouldn't be a very good system. Because what it does is that you may have heard of the Streisand effect. So the Streisand effect was an attempt by the actress Barbara Streisand this is pre-social media days, to prevent a photo of her house being published because someone took a photo of her coastal house and claimed it was damaging the cliff face or something like that. So she sought to have it banned so no one could see her face. So what happened? It went viral. Millions and millions of people wanted to know, well, what is this photo? And we saw that in Australia with Australia's e-safety commissioner when she tried to ban the footage of a stabbing attack in a Sydney church in Wakeley. I'm sure you're familiar with it. She said, "Oh, that's damaging material online. I want to ban it." Of course, it had the complete opposite effect. It became popular around the world. Far more people saw it than if they had simply um, ignored it. And worse than just drawing attention to things, it can actually add legitimacy to fringe viewpoints. Because they can always argue the government's trying to silence me, the government's trying to silence me. So what should really just be fringe views that are ignored can actually seem to be elevated by the government seeming to censor them. Um, Another point is that this legislation is highly undemocratic, and I don't simply mean that it can silence free speech. I mean, the very premise of it is undemocratic. In a democracy, the way it works is that the key decisions are made by the voting public and those as expressed through elections. And that is premised on the idea that we are individual agents who are capable of making up our own minds on things, and that the collective wisdom of the electorate is the best way to run a society. This legislation is premised on the idea that most people are too stupid to discern truth from falsehood. They're too easily led astray. They're led down rabbit warrens. Why else could someone possibly vote for Donald Trump? Why else could someone possibly vote against the Voice? Why else could someone possibly oppose to being locked down in their house during COVID? It's because they've been lied to and misinformation. And that's a very dangerous premise because if you follow that to its conclusion, the idea that if people actually aren't capable of discerning for themselves truth from falsehood, but we need to be guided to that outcome by experts and other credentialed people and governments and bureaucrats, it's a pretty short step to saying maybe the experts should just run things completely. So they're founded on an undemocratic process. Once we start accepting this idea that people cannot be trusted to come up with their own viewpoint, it leads to a pretty dark place. And I'll finish on this point. I think these laws will be terrible for the Jewish community. It really empowers this academic expert class who will be the ones running the fact checkers. They will be the ones who appointed experts to oversee whether something is misinformation or disinformation. They'll be the ones running ACMA. And I think we've seen since October 7 last year the deplorable state of our formerly elite institutions and the way the different treatment they provide to the Jewish community compared to other minority groups. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, such as the testimony given by the head of Harvard and other universities. Um, I don't think empowering that class is a good thing, and it certainly wouldn't be good for the Jewish
Mm.
community. Um, I'll wrap that up there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. Before we open up to general questions, I want to ask you about a few concepts just to comment on very briefly. Um, what's the timing of this, the legislative process, given that we have a federal election, say, within 6 months or so? Is it going to happen in this term of Parliament? Can it be, I guess, deferred until an election, and hopefully we'll get a government that has a different approach?
The government wants to have a vote on this before Christmas.
Wow.
There was a committee hearing that the IPA gave some testimony to. That hearing report will be handed down on the 25th of November, which is the Monday of the last sitting week of the year. And my sources tell me that they will try to push it through in that last sitting week. It'll come down to the votes, assuming everyone else votes as expected, it'll come down to about 3 or 4 crossbenchers. So I've got my concerns that it will pass. The other two options are that it will be rejected, which would be the best outcome. Um, there is some possibility that one of the crossbenchers will say we need more time and kick it into next year, which will also, I think, be positive because it'll start pushing it up against a potential election and it might get dropped.
Mm.
Um, but the reality is it'll probably come for a vote the last week of November.
Well, now, how does it affect an organisation like ours, a community organisation that's at the cutting edge of some contentious political debates from time to time? So if we wanted to argue, for example, that it's the Jewish people that are indigenous to the land of Israel, that the concept of a Palestinian people is entirely a false narrative that was recently invented, or take it one step further. There is a group that is way more prone to violence and terrorism than another group, and we name them. That could be causing friction in the society, etc. I mean, can we continue to participate in the important political debates in the way that we've been doing?
Well, yeah, one of the items of serious harm is vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the rest of the sort of alphabet of groups. So someone could argue that what you just said, David, could be vilification against a group, and therefore it would constitute serious harm. So then the question will be,
Hmm.
well, is what you said misinformation? And that's where it's going to come down to fact checkers and the viewpoints of social media companies and ultimately ACMA. And if they say, no, your conception of indigeneity or your the criminal statistics that you're citing lack, cultural context or whatever, it's misinformation. Therefore, the social media companies were obligated to censor it. And that could be in various forms. It could be the taking down of particular posts. It could be that, your social media channels get downplayed, at least during some period of controversy, um, or completely banned from social media because of that, because you've expressed that viewpoint.
Yeah, leads to self-censorship too, John.
Well, that's it. You might start thinking. I mean, I think those issues you just raised would be great for debate. Certainly, would be happy to hear the other side, and that's how a society should work. But you might just think, uh, No, I don't want to risk the channel. I don't want to risk the reputation of the Australian Jewish Association. Let's drop that topic from our
Yep.
schedule, and that's exactly what they want to happen.
Yep. One of the areas that's been highlighted in the legislation is health, and I'm just going to do a little bit of an indulgence and show you this particular article, which is published in the Spectator magazine, but I made comments repeatedly beforehand. I claim to be the first person in the country to explain why the COVID Safe app would not work. At the time, that particular tool was endorsed by the health bureaucrats, it was endorsed by government. And here am I coming out publicly saying, no, it's not going to do what the government promised, it's not going to work. If the legislation was in place at the time, would those comments have been vulnerable? And 2 or 3 years later, it just so happens that what I said has been proved correct and what the government's position was at the time was incorrect. So it's got to be the quintessential example of that you alluded to about how the timing is an impossible constraint.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, it would have to be done in real time. You would have to have an opinion on something like that in advance to be able to determine it. The first question is, and I don't have a view off the top of my head, and I wish I did, is whether the Spectator Australia would qualify as professional news service. So it may very well it may very well be that them publishing it is okay. But then if you said the exact same thing in a different forum, it wouldn't be. So you've got that sort of two-tiered approach. Spectator Australia are fantastic, but that does elevate mainstream news to a sort of more elevated position, what they can say, what they wish. So that's a threshold question. But then, yeah, it fairly falls into the category of potential category of harm to public health in Australia, including to the efficacy of preventative health measures in Australia. So someone can say the app is a preventative health measure. And I think it's so dangerous when we start applying this in the context of health. I mean, I'm looking at some of the faces in the crowd. Looks like a lot of parents. I know as a parent that what I was told as to how I should sleep my children at night changed during the time they were children. You know, you'd start, put them on their stomach, no, on their back, no, sudden infant death syndrome is genetic. It doesn't matter what you do. It changes over time. Please don't take that as medical advice, by the way. But the point is, it changes as the evidence changes. That doesn't mean medical advice is pointless or stupid, but it does change. And in something like a pandemic, it's going to change in a dynamic fashion. And what I fear is that if the government have established effectively an official truth, no, this is the right approach, and anything contrary to it is misinformation that needs to be silenced. And during the committee, it was very clear that they're targeting COVID-19 misinformation. That's going to lead to an incentive for the government to dig their heels in, for them to go, we don't want to face the embarrassment of having established an official truth and to backtrack on it because people have been silenced on that. We better maintain our position rather than it be, this is our best evidence at the time, open to public debate, but the government policy is X, and if the debate changes, we'll change with it.
Okay. John, we'll throw open to questions, but I'll just show people what's happening next week and then back to Tennille. As we always do, if there's anyone here who's not yet actively supporting AJA, after the event, please go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, make a contribution, make sure that you've subscribed to the emails. We do have our charity event, our annual charity event coming up. And if there's anyone who is able to make a significant donation and be a matcher for the campaign, please get in touch directly, and we'd love to involve you as a partner. Next week, we have David Hazoni talking about the war against the Jews, the change that's happened since the 7th of October last year. Obviously, there's a war against Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, but also worldwide in many places there's been unleashed anti-Semitism and aggression against the Jewish people of a scale that we haven't seen before. So that'll be the subject of analysis next week. So, Tennealle, you happy to manage your questions?
Thank you, David. I'd also like to add, with our charity campaign, if you are available to volunteer on the day, Sunday, the 24th of November, even if it's just a couple of hours, Sydney, Melbourne, or remotely, we do need some volunteers. So message me in the chat or email me, Tennealle, TENEILLE, at jewishassociation.org.au, and I'll coordinate that. We'll go to our questions now. I'll invite Harvey to unmute, please.
Thanks a lot. Surely if Peter Dutton came out and was really pro-free speech, that he'd run away with this election, if assuming that the misinformation bill passed as you fear it will be. Why haven't the Liberal Party done that? I know that they introduced this in misinformation bill, but that was under the Morrison government. So why haven't they actually done something like that to get the desired result, winning the election?
Yeah, the coalition have been, I'll give them a pass mark on this issue, that they are opposing this bill. And that's despite the fact, as you point out, that the former communications minister was the one who first proposed censorship of misinformation. I agree. I think it's a vote winner. I think running on this issue shouldn't be something the coalition should be afraid of. But my concern is that they'll oppose it, it'll get up anyway, and then they'll be tepid on it during the election. And if they win, they'll, often the ability to censor information is a far more attractive when you're in government than when you're in opposition, or that they'll just, a bit like, Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, they'll promise it in opposition and then think, oh, well, it's too hard. So certainly, I hope it gets defeated in the Senate. I hope it doesn't get up. If it does get up, I hope the coalition commit to repealing it in office. But it's good that they've opposed it, but they don't seem like they really want to grab it as a cultural issue, which to me is crazy, because when Peter Dutton firmly got behind the Voice, opposition to the Voice, he completely transformed that debate, and his popularity went up. I mean, having a stance on some of these cultural issues, I think, is a winner. But the coalition scene, well, I'll give them a pass mark. I won't be too critical yet.
Thank you. We'll go to our next question. Hugh Kitson, unmute, please.
Am I right in thinking, John, from what you said, that mainstream media is exempt from this? And the question I've got is there any recourse to the courts?
There's certainly no recourse. So if you, as a social media user, if you post something on social media and it gets taken down, deemed misinformation, you have no recourse to the courts, none whatsoever. These misinformation codes will require there to be a dispute resolution process. So you'll be able to make a complaint to Facebook or whoever silenced your viewpoint. But if you've ever made a complaint to a bank or an insurance company or a government agency, you know the drill. You're at their mercy and they may or may not change their mind. There is no recourse to the courts whatsoever. Obviously, when imposing fines, the social media companies will be able to challenge that in the courts and argue that it was or wasn't misinformation. So they will have the ability to appeal fines, but the social media users that are affected will have no right to appeal, which we think is a crucial failing of this legislation. There should be consequences for over censoring as well. I'd rather it be completely abolished, but if you're going to have fines for spreading misinformation, you should also have fines for falsely censoring innocent opinions that were completely truthful.
Thank you. Shane, would you like to unmute?
Yes, good evening. There is a lot of misinformation out there, like contrails and vaccinations cause autism and 5G gives you cancer. Are you opposed to this bill in its current form, or are you opposed to any form of, I guess, correcting misinformation out there? Or would you prefer to see something like community notes like they have on X, where the post remains, but you can put a note in there that says, look, there's no evidence to support this claim. It's all bunkum.
Yeah. Yeah. My view is that the best solution to misinformation is free speech. There's an old saying, I think it might be attributable to Winston Churchill, but a lie has spread halfway around the world before the truth has gotten out of bed. But I don't think that's true in the digital age. So if you look at a social media post on a controversial issue, which may very well be false or misleading, all you have to do in the first couple of comments will be someone saying, this is rubbish, that's false, that's untrue. I think that having the debate is the best way. Look, I'm not saying that everything on the internet is true or that it can't be harmful, but I think the best way to approach it is free speech. What I would also say is that there's actually very little evidence that people are that misinformation causes harm. Very little serious analysis that happens. The only report that I have read suggests that misinformation online tends to reinforce pre-existing biases. So if you love Donald Trump and Donald Trump says a bit of a porcupine, you might fall for it. It doesn't convince anyone else. And you can think of 100 other examples. So maybe it does reinforce pre-existing biases, but it probably doesn't change behaviour in the way that the proponents of this legislation think, in the sense of really changing votes or the sort of medical advice that people will take. There certainly is not enough evidence to suggest that, in contrast to the attacks on free speech. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some people that might be swayed one way or another by misinformation, but it's probably on the margins. And bearing in mind, I would put it this way, our biggest concern is that, yes, misinformation, got to acknowledge it's a problem, but the cure is worse than the disease. And then empowering governments to censor free speech will be worse than whatever harm that misinformation is supposedly causing.
Thank you. Dr. Michael DePercy, I will invite you to unmute. Hold on, I just unmute. There we go.
Thank you so much. I'm both a member of the AJA and the IPA, so I appreciate the opportunity tonight. John, my question is about AI. I wrote an opinion piece today that somebody obviously edited using AI, and it toned down my opinion to make it a bit more palatable for the particular audience. So what I'm really worried about is if we're going to have these free speech debates that are then going to be moderated by AI, which is obviously left-leaning, Where do we end up in this space? Like, I actually am having an existential crisis as a result of what happened to me today. So I'm really worried about this for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, if you're worried about AI, then you should be. A lot of people think, oh, well, this legislation will help deal with AI, deep fakes, and all that sort of stuff. It won't, because the way it works is that the social media companies have to set up systems to deal with misinformation. Now, ultimately, that's probably will have a human element of, well, what topics are misinformation, and how do we prevent it spreading? But there'll probably be algorithms that try to detect and deal with it. And therefore, the social media companies will probably use forms of AI to regulate social media. Now, I don't know if you saw the early controversies over, I think it was Google's AI, Gemini, I think it's called Gemini Google. And if you typed in, do a picture of a white male, it would come up as a black woman. Draw a picture of the founding fathers, and it would come up with a picture of an Indian, a Native American. Draw a picture of the Pope, and it was a black woman. It was clearly trying to not just be truthful, it was clearly trying to nudge behaviour in the most ridiculous and ham-fisted and embarrassing method. But what I wrote at the time on the Spectator Australia was, well, what if this AI system was the one that was regulating misinformation under this law? It would clearly have a certain bias against certain viewpoints. So AI is a big problem, because people think about AI as sort of like self-thinking. AI will have the same prejudices and biases as the programmers that create it and create its algorithms. And if they create it with a certain bias, it will adopt that. Some people think AI could eradicate bias, maybe in a utopia, but the reality is, the way it's being adopted has this. AI will have the same political prejudices as Silicon Valley. Now, there is an issue with deep fakes and fake material like that, and there may need to be some sort of regulation of that sort of things. Things need to be clearly marked satire. If people are depicted in a way that it's not really them, graphic fake images of Taylor Swift was doing the rounds at one stage. Maybe something needs to be done to do that. But the thing about that is it's an objective test. Is that or is that not Taylor Swift? And is it or is it not marked parody? So the biases of the decision maker don't come into it. The problem with things like, causing harm to the Australian community, I mean, that's very subjective.
Thank you. Jason, would you like to unmute, please?
Yeah, g'day, John. Like the previous speaker, I'm also an IPA member. So the question I've got is, as a private person who runs a blog where I annoy family and friends with my views on the world, does this bill affect me, or might it in the future?
I think it probably does. And if you're a digital user, a digital services provider is the term, it may very well be that not only would you be subject in the sense that content you post on various channels might be caught just like anyone else, but you might have obligations to implement a misinformation code. I'm not quite across the demarcation of who's in and who's out, and need some legal advice on that. But I have heard that that is a concern as well, that probably more from a red tape and bureaucracy and over-regulation perspective, that it won't just be the Facebooks and Twitters of the world that get caught, but smaller platforms that moderate group chats and that sort of thing might similarly be caught by it. But rather than other than just maybe foreshadowing that, I'm not quite across the demarcation of exactly who's in and who's out beyond what I've just said. So please don't take that as legal advice that you're definitely caught. But it's yeah, it is a concern that it may have wider application than expected. I mean, most regulations do.
Thank you. Could Anne please unmute?
Hello. So my name's Han, and I'm just like you've already highlighted that the media or the government has a left-wing bias. So my question is, well, I have two questions. One is regards to the gender ideology and the censoring of Billboard Chris with Elon Musk challenging our e-censorship. How would that affect the misinformation and disinformation bill when, according to researchers, I think Fury, I can publish New York Times, whatever the case is, New York Post, doctor refuses to publish the research into puberty blockers, saying there's no evidence that it helps children. So would that be classified as disinformation? And the other one I want to highlight, and this is in Melbourne, Victoria, is that I wonder if this would be classified as misinformation and disinformation if parents are concerned that the magistrate court are instructed on how to avoid having, let's just say, minor attracted people deported, since it goes against the left's open border policy. So I'm just wanting to know.
Yeah. Well, short answer is, I mean, it's in the definition of harm, includes vilification of a group in society distinguished by sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status. That would be the three. So definitely, I mean, it's fairly targeted that this trans issue that society's facing. Censorship in Australia, it's sort of three overarching sort of Venn diagrams. One is called cyber abuse, and that's where particularly users are targeted for abuse, and that's e-safety. So she went after Billboard Chris on the basis of a complaint by an Australian advisor to some UN committee, and said, well, that's abuse of a person on the basis of their gender identity. The other is our various hate speech laws. So the idea is, you can't offend certain groups. I see it's not well enforced against the Jewish community, those rules. But anyway, and the third one is misinformation. So cyber abuse or harm, hate speech, misinformation. And misinformation is the broadest of them all because it doesn't necessarily require a complainant. It doesn't require intention. You just have to be wrong according to the government. And if you say, biological men cannot become women merely by changing their pronouns, or whatever other, you shouldn't be allowed to play in sport because of their biological differences, or whatever way this issue gets framed, they can say, well, that's false. That's false. No, gender is a social construct, and you have vilified a group on the basis of their gender identity. And so this will be far broader than those other categories because it won't require any particular person to have made a complaint, simply the perception that it's a false view and it could cause harm or could contribute to harm to that group. And then that viewpoint will be taken down. So it will have an overlapping effect on the Billboard Chris sort of a view of the world. I'll have to go back to that specific post, whether it could be caught, but that viewpoint that he was expressing could very well be silenced. And as you say, I mean, we can't rely on the mainstream media to reveal any errors in space, because they'll pull anything that's contrary to that agenda.
Thank you. Leon, would you like to unmute, please?
Yes. Does any other democratic regime have this sort of legislation on its statute books? And if so, how's it been working?
Sadly, this creeping trend of censorship and the eradication of free speech is a virus that's spreading across the entire Western world, which by the definition of Western was formerly free and democratic. We've got very similar laws proposed in Canada and something similar in the United Kingdom. The United States has the First Amendment. It's a little bit trickier, but they're dealing with it in other ways. As I said, it comes in various guises. Ours will be the most comprehensive censorship regime on this issue of misinformation. So it's an accolade we could do with that. But on those three areas of online harm, hate speech, and misinformation, there are various regimes that interact and duplicate and whatever. What I guarantee is that Australia's proposal, because we're the first movers in this misinformation space to the same extent. The UK has some similar laws, but you've got to prove hate, so it's slightly narrower and some other things. But I guarantee it'll be adopted elsewhere. That's the way this works. Certainly, the European Union is imposing new online misinformation censorship rules, again, targeting X. And so, yeah, it is a problem. It's nothing exactly like Australia's, but the idea of limiting freedom of speech, you could not believe that just a few months ago, there was a headline in the United Kingdom, 55-year-old woman arrested for saying false information online. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is something out of Orwell. So a woman gets arrested for being wrong and saying it online, allegedly wrong. And now this was to do with the Southport riots and the allegations of false statements about immigrants caused those riots. And this is a great example that I think just today, the police withheld. So the Southport riots were caused by a stabbing by a man of children, and the identity of the person was wrongly made out. And today it was revealed that the police withheld that he had terrorist paraphernalia, this man. So it may very well have been a foreign-sponsored terrorist attack. And people were put in jail for saying that. So it's just a terrible indictment of leadership in the West. To get back to that first question by that gentleman, centre-right parties have been asleep for too long and haven't properly fought for the essential freedoms of liberty of expression. We're suffering through that now. I just hope that it's reached the tide will ebb out and recede. But right now, it's not a very good time when it comes to freedom of speech in the West.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session. It is 9 p.m. here in Sydney. Our final question, we can see there's a lot of passionate people in the chat and online tonight. What can we do? What action points can we take?
Well, look, governments are susceptible to public opinion. Crossbenchers are susceptible to public opinion. Let your local member know that you are opposed to this law, if that's your viewpoint, or if the law gets up that you want it dealt with at the next election. support organisations like this Australian Jewish Association, the Institute of Public Affairs, who, our membership and donations allow people like me to appear in Senate inquiries and to do the research necessary to spread this message. And of course, just tell your own networks that you think this is a bad idea. Beyond that, it can feel overwhelming and depressing, but I think that there's a lot we can do. We have a lot of agency over our future if people are willing to act. Unfortunately, we've been too unwilling to tackle this issue for too long.
Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you very much. I'd like to remind you that this was recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow, on our Facebook page. There were some very, very important points made tonight, and it is important that you share this information, that other people know about the proposed changes, and that they understand that we are not powerless. We have the ability to put our voice forward, to lobby our government, and to make sure that we are protected. So please share this with your friends, share the recording. John Storey and the IPA, I'd like to thank you very much for your partnership on tonight's event. It's been a pleasure to have you, and we wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.